Dean Martin's fist connected with Jerry Lewis's jaw at exactly 11:47 p.m. on June 12, 1956. The sound of the impact cut through the laughter and music at Humphrey Bogart's Holmby Hills mansion like a gunshot. Ice cubes rattled in suddenly frozen hands. Someone dropped a champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, but nobody looked down. They were all staring at Dean Martin. He was standing over Jerry Lewis, who had stumbled backward into a leather chair, hand pressed to his reddening face. Dean's eyes were cold. Not angry, not heated. Just dead cold, like someone had flipped a switch and turned off everything human inside him. He straightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, and then he did something that made the moment even more terrifying. He smiled, that famous Dean Martin smile. But there was nothing warm about it, nothing kind. "We're done here," Dean said quietly. Then he walked out of the party, got into his Cadillac, and drove away. Jerry Lewis sat in that chair for another 20 minutes, not saying a word to anyone. And in that silence, one of the most successful partnerships in entertainment history began its slow, painful death. To understand what happened that night at Bogart's party, you need to understand what Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis were in 1956. They weren't just famous. They weren't just successful. They were a cultural phenomenon. They were the biggest comedy team in America, maybe the biggest in the world. Martin and Lewis. The handsome crooner and the manic comedian. The straight man and the wild card. Oil and water that somehow mixed into pure gold. In 1956, they were making $75,000 a week in Las Vegas. That's over $800,000 a week in today's money. Their movies were box office juggernauts. Partners, artists, and models, Hollywood or bust, every single one. Printing money. They had a radio show. They had a TV show. They were on magazine covers, in newspapers, on every screen in America. When they walked into a room together, the room stopped. When they performed, audiences couldn't breathe from laughing. They were lightning in a bottle, and everyone knew it. Everyone except maybe Dean and Jerry themselves. Because by June of 1956, the partnership was already cracking. Not visibly. The audiences couldn't see it. The studios couldn't see it. But the people who knew them, the people who worked with them every day, they could feel it. The temperature between Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis had been dropping degree by degree for months. Dean Martin was 38 years old in 1956. He'd clawed his way up from Steubenville, Ohio, where his father cut hair and ran numbers for the mob. He'd been a boxer, a card dealer, a blackjack dealer, a singer in smoky nightclubs where the audience threw bottles if they didn't like you. He'd changed his name from Dino Crocetti to Dean Martin because Italian names didn't sell in 1942 America. He'd worked. God, had he worked. Years of one-night stands, driving from town to town, sleeping in flop houses, singing the same songs to different drunks in different cities. And he'd made it. He'd become Dean Martin, movie star, recording artist, headliner. But deep down, underneath the tuxedo and the smooth voice and the cool persona, Dean never forgot where he came from. He never forgot being the Italian kid who had to prove he belonged. He never forgot the people who looked down on him, who made him feel small. And he never, ever forgot his family. Jerry Lewis was 30 years old in 1956. He'd been born Joseph Levitch in Newark, New Jersey, to a show business family. His parents were vaudeville performers. He'd been on stage since he was 5 years old. Comedy was in his blood, in his bones, in his DNA. Jerry was brilliant. There's no other word for it. He could make people laugh just by walking across a room. His physical comedy was genius level. His timing was perfect. His energy was inexhaustible. On stage, on camera, Jerry Lewis was a force of nature. But Jerry also had something else. He had ambition that burned so hot it could melt steel. He didn't just want to be funny. He wanted to be important. He wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted to be an artist with a capital A. And increasingly, Jerry felt like Dean was holding him back. The tension had been building for over a year. Jerry wanted more creative control. He wanted to direct. He wanted to do serious films. He felt like the Martin and Lewis formula was getting stale, getting old, getting beneath him. Dean, on the other hand, was perfectly happy with the formula. Why fix what wasn't broken? They were making a fortune. Audiences loved them. The studios loved them. What more did Jerry want? But there was something else bothering Dean. Something that hurt more than Jerry's artistic ambitions. Jerry had started making comments. Little digs, casual remarks that seemed like jokes but had sharp edges underneath. Comments about Dean's background. Comments about his family. Comments that maybe sounded like ribbing to other people but felt like disrespect to Dean. In March of 1956, during rehearsals for their film Hollywood or Bust, Jerry had made a crack about Dean's Italian accent when he was tired. Dean had laughed it off, but friends noticed he went quiet for the rest of the day. In April, at a party at Frank Sinatra's house, Jerry had done an impression of Dean's father speaking broken English. People had laughed. Dean had smiled. But Sammy Davis Jr., who was standing next to Dean, later said he felt Dean's whole body go rigid. In May, Jerry had told a reporter that Dean was just the singer, while he, Jerry, was the creative force behind Martin and Lewis. The article had run in Variety. Dean had read it in his dressing room and hadn't said a word about it, but he'd started arriving later to rehearsals, started leaving earlier, started putting distance between himself and his partner. The people around them could feel it coming. Something was going to break. They just didn't know when. June 12th, 1956, Humphrey Bogart's house in Holmby Hills. Bogart was throwing one of his legendary parties. Everyone who was anyone in Hollywood was there. Sinatra, Judy Garland, Spencer Tracy, Lauren Bacall, Marilyn Monroe. The champagne was French. The caviar was Russian. The cigars were Cuban. It was the kind of party where careers were made and legends were born. Dean and Jerry arrived separately, which was unusual. They usually showed up to these things together, the dynamic duo, working the room as a team. But that night, Dean arrived at 9 p.m. with his wife, Jean. Jerry showed up an hour later with his wife, Patty. The party was in full swing. People were drinking, laughing, telling stories. Bogart was holding court in the living room, doing his Humphrey Bogart thing, tough and charming and magnetic. Sinatra was at the piano, playing and singing. A circle of people gathered around him like he was the sun. Dean was on the terrace, smoking a cigarette, talking to Spencer Tracy about golf. He seemed relaxed, easy. Classic Dean Martin, the king of cool, not a care in the world. Jerry was inside, being Jerry, loud, energetic, making people laugh with his voices and his faces and his physical comedy. He was on tonight, really on, and people were eating it up. He was the center of attention, exactly where he loved to be. At around 11:30 p.m., someone suggested they get a picture of Martin and Lewis together. The photographer from Life magazine was there, and it would make a great shot for their upcoming spread on Hollywood's power players. Dean came in from the terrace. Jerry was by the bar. They posed together, arms around each other, big smiles. The camera flashed. The photographer thanked them. The moment was over, but Jerry didn't let it end there. "Hey, Dino," Jerry said loudly, loud enough for the people around them to hear. "You know what we should do next? We should make a movie where I play the smart one and you play my chauffeur. You know, really lean into that whole Italian servant thing you've got going." Some people laughed. Uncomfortable laughter, but laughter. Jerry grinned, writing the reaction. Dean's face didn't change. "That's funny, Jerry. I'm serious," Jerry continued. "We could call it The Bellboy and The Busboy. You could do a great accent, really play up the immigrant angle. People love that stuff." The laughter was dying now. People were starting to sense something was wrong. The energy in the room was shifting. Dean took a slow sip of his drink. "You done?" Jerry, not reading the room, kept going. "Come on, don't be so sensitive. You know I'm kidding. Your family won't mind. It's not like they understand show business anyway, right? What does your old man do, cut hair and run numbers?" The room went silent. Dean set his drink down on the bar. Very slowly, very deliberately. "What did you just say?" Jerry's grin faltered. He'd finally realized he'd crossed a line, but he was too far in to back out gracefully. "Dean, come on. It's a joke. Don't be so—" Dean's fist caught him clean on the jaw. A perfect right cross, thrown with the precision of the boxer Dean had been 20 years ago. Jerry's head snapped back. He stumbled, grabbed for the bar, missed, and fell into the leather chair behind him. The sound of the punch echoed through Bogart's house like a bell. Everyone froze. Dean stood over Jerry, breathing hard. His hand was already starting to swell. Jerry was holding his jaw, eyes wide with shock and something else. Fear. Real fear. "You can say whatever you want about me," Dean said quietly. His voice was calm, too calm. "You can tell the world you're the talent, and I'm just the singer. You can take all the credit for everything we've built. I don't care about that." He leaned down slightly, making sure Jerry could hear every word. "But you do not talk about my family. You do not mock my father. And you do not ever disrespect where I come from." He straightened up, adjusted his tie, fixed his cufflinks. "We're done here." Then Dean Martin walked out of Humphrey Bogart's house, got into his Cadillac, and drove home. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't apologize. He didn't look back. In the leather chair, Jerry Lewis sat with his hand on his jaw, staring at nothing. Patty, his wife, rushed over to him. "Jerry, are you okay? Should we get ice?" Jerry shook his head slowly. He wasn't okay. And ice wasn't going to fix what had just broken. Bogart, standing near the piano, looked at Sinatra. Sinatra looked back. Neither of them said anything. They didn't have to. They'd both just witnessed the end of something that could never be repaired. The party continued, but the energy was gone. People left earlier than usual. The photographer from Life never used the picture of Martin and Lewis. It stayed in a vault for 60 years. The next morning, Dean Martin's hand was purple and swollen. Jean brought him ice and aspirin and sat with him in the kitchen while he drank black coffee and stared out the window. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. "No. Are you going to apologize?" Dean looked at her. "For what?" She didn't answer. She knew her husband. She knew about his pride, his history, his fierce protection of his family, and his heritage. She knew that in Dean's mind, Jerry had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That same morning, Jerry Lewis's jaw was bruised and swollen. He sat in his own kitchen, holding an ice pack to his face, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. Patty sat across from him. "You need to call him." "And say what?" "That you're sorry. That you went too far. That you didn't mean it." Jerry shook his head. "He hit me, Patty. In front of everyone. Who does that? Someone whose father you just mocked in public." Jerry was silent. He knew she was right. He knew he'd been wrong, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. On Monday, June 14th, 1956, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis showed up for work at Paramount Studios. They were scheduled to do promotional appearances for Hollywood or Bust, which was set to premiere in July. They stood next to each other. They smiled for cameras. They answered questions from reporters. To the outside world, everything looked normal. Martin and Lewis, the greatest comedy team in America, doing their thing. But anyone who looked closely could see the truth. They weren't looking at each other. They weren't riffing off each other. They weren't touching each other, even casually. There was a space between them now. Invisible, but impenetrable. That day, Dean's publicist got a call from Jerry's publicist. The message was simple. From now on, Dean and Jerry would only communicate through their representatives. No more casual phone calls. No more dropping by each other's dressing rooms. Business only. Dean's publicist delivered the message. Dean just nodded. Fine by me. For the next year, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis maintained their partnership in public and their silence in private. They fulfilled their contracts, they made appearances, they did their shows, but off stage, off camera, they didn't speak. On the set of Hollywood or Bust, the crew noticed immediately. Martin and Lewis, who used to joke around between takes, who used to grab lunch together, who used to be inseparable, now existed in separate orbits. Dean would arrive, do his scenes, and leave. Jerry would arrive, do his scenes, and leave. If they had to interact for a shot, they were professional, perfect, even. But the moment the director yelled cut, the wall came back up. The director, Frank Tashlin, tried to mediate once. He pulled them both aside. Guys, whatever happened between you, we've got 6 more weeks on this film. Can we at least— We're doing our jobs, Dean said. That's all the contract says we have to do. Jerry said nothing. He just walked away. The film wrapped in August. It would be the last Martin and Lewis movie ever made. On July 25th, 1956, Martin and Lewis performed their final show together at the Copacabana in New York. 10 years to the day after their first performance as a team. The room was packed with 800 people who had no idea they were watching history end. Dean sang. Jerry did his comedy. They did their bits, their routines, the material that had made them famous, and it worked. The audience laughed and applauded and cheered. To them, Martin and Lewis were still magic. But backstage, after the final bow, Dean and Jerry didn't speak. They went to separate dressing rooms. They left through separate exits. Jerry went left, Dean went right, and that was it. The official announcement came on August 21st, 1956. Martin and Lewis were splitting up. The partnership was over. The press went crazy. Reporters wanted to know why. What happened? What went wrong? Was there another woman? A money dispute? Creative differences? Both men refused to comment beyond prepared statements. Dean's statement. Jerry and I have decided to pursue separate career paths. I wish him all the best. Jerry's statement. Dean and I have decided that after 10 wonderful years, it's time for us to grow in different directions. I'll always treasure our partnership. Polite, professional, utterly devoid of truth. The press dug. They interviewed people who'd been at Bogart's party. Most refused to talk. A few gave vague answers about tension and an incident, but nobody would say what actually happened. Hollywood closed ranks. Some things stayed private. For the next 20 years, whenever Dean was asked about the split, he gave the same answer. These things happen. Jerry wanted to do his thing. I wanted to do mine. That's all there is to it. Whenever Jerry was asked, he said, Dean and I just grew apart. It's nobody's fault. It's just life. Both men went on to massive solo success. Jerry became a director, a philanthropist, a legend of comedy. Dean became a member of the Rat Pack, a Las Vegas icon, a star bigger than he'd ever been with Jerry. They existed in the same industry, the same town, the same social circles, but they never spoke. Not at parties, not at charity events, not at award shows. When they found themselves in the same room, which was rare, they acknowledged each other with a nod, nothing more. In 1976, Frank Sinatra orchestrated a surprise reunion on his television special. He brought Dean out on stage, and then, without warning, Jerry walked out. The audience went insane. 20 years of waiting for this moment. Dean and Jerry hugged. They smiled. They seemed to be crying. It was beautiful and emotional and perfect television. But when the camera stopped rolling, Dean and Jerry barely spoke. They took a few pictures. They shook hands. They went their separate ways. The wound might have scabbed over, but it never healed. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. Jerry Lewis released a statement. Dean was a great talent and a good man. I'm saddened by his passing. That was it. No stories, no memories, no reflection on what they'd built together or what they'd lost. Just a polite, distant statement about a man Jerry had once called his best friend. For years, people wondered what really happened that night at Bogart's party. What was said? What was the final straw? Why couldn't two men who'd achieved so much together ever find their way back to friendship? The truth stayed buried with the witnesses, most of whom died without talking. Bogart, Sinatra, Tracy, most of the people who'd been there that night took the secret to their graves. But in 2017, everything changed. A man named Richard Bacallion, a character actor who'd been friends with both Dean and Jerry, gave an interview at age 88. He'd been at Bogart's party. He'd been standing 10 feet away when it happened, and after 60 years of silence, he decided to tell the truth. Jerry was drunk, Bacallion said. Not falling down drunk, but drunk enough to lose his filter. He started making jokes about Dean's father, about Italian immigrants, about how they talked and acted. Dean asked him to stop. Jerry didn't stop. The interviewer pressed him. What exactly did Jerry say? Bacallion hesitated. Then he continued. Jerry said Dean's father was basically a criminal who cut hair as a front. He said the whole family was connected to the mob. He said Dean should be ashamed of where he came from instead of pretending to be some sophisticated nightclub singer. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. He humiliated Dean in front of the biggest names in Hollywood. The interviewer asked the question everyone wanted answered. Why did Dean react so strongly? Bacallion didn't hesitate. Because it was true. Not the way Jerry said it, but Dean's father did have connections. Dean had spent his whole life trying to separate himself from that, trying to prove he was legitimate, that he'd made it on talent, not connections. And Jerry knew that. He knew exactly where to hurt Dean, and he did it anyway. When the interview was published, it went viral. 60 years of mystery solved in a few hundred words. The reactions poured in. Some people sided with Dean. He was defending his family, his father, his heritage. How could Jerry be so cruel? Others sided with Jerry. It was just a joke. Dean overreacted. You don't punch your partner over words. But the people who knew Dean Martin, the ones who really knew him, they understood. They understood that Dean had spent his entire life fighting against the stereotype of the Italian criminal, the connected guy, the gangster. He'd changed his name. He'd perfected his image. He'd built a career on being smooth, sophisticated, untouchable. And Jerry, his partner, his friend, the person who knew him better than almost anyone, had stripped all that away in front of a room full of their peers and colleagues, had reduced him to a stereotype, had made him small. That's what Dean couldn't forgive. Not the words themselves, but the betrayal behind them. Jerry had used Dean's deepest insecurity as ammunition for a joke, and once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The tragedy of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis isn't that they stopped working together. Lots of partnerships end. The tragedy is that they stopped being friends. Two men who'd built something extraordinary together, who'd made millions of people laugh, who'd shared success beyond their wildest dreams, couldn't find a way past one terrible moment. Pride is a powerful thing. So is hurt. Dean's pride wouldn't let him forgive. Jerry's pride wouldn't let him apologize properly. And so they spent 40 years passing each other like strangers, carrying a wound that never quite closed. There's a recording from that final show at the Copacabana in 1956. If you listen closely, you can hear it. The laughter is there. The timing is perfect. The chemistry still works. But underneath it all, you can hear the distance. You can hear two men who are together but fundamentally apart. Dean Martin once said, "I don't hold grudges. Life's too short." But when it came to Jerry Lewis, he held that grudge for 40 years. And maybe that tells you everything you need to know about how deep the hurt went. When Jerry Lewis died in 2017, a reporter asked one of Dean's daughters if she thought her father would have forgiven Jerry if he'd lived to see that day. She thought for a long moment. Then she said, "My father loved Jerry once. Really loved him. But what Jerry did that night at Bogart's party, what he said about our grandfather, about our family, some things you don't come back from. Some lines, once you cross them, that's it. I think my father forgave Jerry a long time ago, but I don't think he ever forgot. And maybe that's the real lesson. Forgiveness and forgetting aren't the same thing. You can let go of anger and still carry the scar. You can move on with your life and still remember the moment everything changed." Dean Martin's fist connecting with Jerry Lewis's jaw at 11:47 p.m. on June 12, 1956, wasn't just a punch. It was the end of a friendship, the end of a partnership, and the beginning of a silence that lasted until both men were in their graves. All because of words. Words spoken in a moment of drunken carelessness. Words that cut deeper than any punch ever could. Words that can't be taken back.